Today we're covering the best board breakers in Yu-Gi-Oh! In the March 2025 competitive format. How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. Today it's all about board breakers. We're looking at a tier list of the best 30 or so board breakers in the game. And there are a ton of really good ones, but we're also in a format where hand traps are dominating and board breakers just aren't as good. So this video is like the second part of my tier list for this format. Last time around we did a tier list for the best hand traps in the game and there were a ton of amazing options. This time around, the board breakers, while there are many of them, they're not going to be as powerful as the hand traps are going to be. But if you're excited for the video and to learn which board breakers are the best for this current format in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh, then make sure to smash the like button and subscribe to the channel for more. But with that being said, here are the best board breakers in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! For March 2025. So whenever I do a tier list, I have 6 different categories to talk about. The first of which is going to be playable in most main decks. We also have playable in some main decks, playable in most side decks and in some side decks, as well as niche and just don't. Niche is going to be for board breakers that have very specific applications, but are really not going to be as powerful or commonly played in this format. And just don't are for board breakers that are completely outclassed by others in the current format or just don't need to see any play at all right now. And for some decks, certain board breakers might be better than others, so use your judgment to find out which board breaker is best for your given strategy. Now, as always, I start off with alphabetical order, and the first card we're going to be talking about is going to be Alpha Master of Beasts. This card was super hyped upon release and kind of did nothing in a way. The card is fine, and don't get me wrong, but the fact that it's not a quick effect to be able to bounce back the opponent's monster is really a bad thing. I mean, it doesn't target, which is nice, but at the end of the day, it's really not going to be as strong of an option against as many other cards there are in the game. It's also not super flexible, so because of that, I would put it in the just don't tier. Up next is Book of Eclipse, and Book of Eclipse is seeing a lot more popularity in this format because of a few reasons. Number one, it doesn't target, and that's a huge deal, especially going up against a deck like Ryzel. If you're going to use a card like Book of Moon, for example, your opponent can just simply use the detonator, target itself, pop it, and bring it back. And while they can still do that with Book of Eclipse, at least in this regard, you're able to book the rest of the field, which can have its advantages. The card can be negated by Ash Blossom, which is always going to be a negative point against it because Ash is such a popular card in the format. However, it's such a flexible option because it can be great going first and going second. Now, of course, there are going to be some matchups where Book of Eclipse is really weak. For example, going second into a Malice endboard is absolutely awful, but if you're going second into an endboard of Fiendsmith cards, that can be pretty good because you can turn off the Desiree and even the Caesar as well. It's not the perfect card at all, but as a board breaker goes, it's really damn good. So for that reason, I'll put it in the playable in some main decks tier. Book of Moon, on the other hand, is basically a worse version of Book of Eclipse. It targets, it only deals with one card, and sure, it's very flexible and can be used on your own monsters defensively. It's not going to be as prevalent in the format as a board breaker. It has some application, but really only if your specific deck can use its ability to book your own monsters face down. So because of that, it really doesn't go that high on the tier list. In my opinion, Book of Moon could be a lot better, and for that reason, it goes in the niche tier. Change of Heart, and by extension Mind Control, and any card that really just targets to take control of an opponent's monster, in my opinion, they're not that strong right now. Sure, it's pretty good against boards like the Malice endboard, and it can be pretty good against the DDD Wave High King Caesar, but at the end of the day, it's not going to be very impactful against cards like Fiendsmith Desiree, which have targeting protection thanks to the sequence, and also really not good against cards like the Ryzel Detonator. Detonator again just pops itself and then brings itself back with Eclipse Twins, so it can just ignore the card altogether. And sure, you can get rid of a few pieces of interruption, but it's not going to be that impactful. Change of Heart and cards like it just don't have the amount of flexibility they once did, and there's a reason why this card is not seeing any play. In my opinion, just don't play Change of Heart. Cosmic Cyclone was once the most consistently seen card in the side deck for so many different strategies. However, it's kind of fallen out of grace just a little bit. Part of that is because a card like Fire King Island is not seeing anywhere near as much play in this format as it was in the previous format, where if you could Cosmic Cyclone the FKI, it would blow up your opponent's entire field. That's not really the case right now. Even with the card like True Light, which has a similar type of effect, it's not actually going to work when it's banished. However, Cosmic Cyclone is still very flexible. It's able to deal with a lot of really problematic cards your opponent would set face down during your turn or during their turn, and able to deal with a lot of floodgates as well that might be around the game today. However, the card is not seeing as much popularity because it's not as strong in the side deck, and because there are a lot of players that are preferring hand traps to board breakers. But the flexibility of Cosmic Cyclone is still pretty much unmatched. It can deal with field spells, of which there are a ton of them to stop them from resolving. It can deal with any odd back row card, and for that reason, it still does see some play. So for that reason, I'll put it as playable in some side decks. Moving on to Dark Hole. Now, I'm going to cover Dark Hole, Raigeki, Lightning Storm, Harpie's Feather Duster all kind of together or just like one after another to kind of break the alphabetical order of this. However, Dark Hole is a really interesting card. Being a board wipe can be really appealing, and the fact that it destroys obviously has its pros and its cons. For example, you can use it to really threaten a Fiendsmith endboard. It's also really solid against decks like Malice, but it's pretty weak into a Ryzel endboard, especially if they have Detonator, since they can simply detach to protect their monsters. And going into your second turn and your third turn, it ends up being weaker and weaker because if you have cards on your side of the field, they're going to get destroyed, which can really hurt. We're also not in a format where your opponent is actively giving you monsters that are just like floodgates. For example, Nightmare Corruptor Ibli. That being said, if you really want to have more board breakers or you're playing a deck like Tenpai Dragon, for example, it can be really clutch. For me, Dark Hole really belongs towards the end of this tier, but it still is a niche card. Raigeki, on the other hand, is very similar to Dark Hole, where it's just a free board wipe for one card. However, in certain situations, it can be better, and that's usually going to be when you actually have cards on your side of the field and you don't want to get rid of them. Now, it's very similar, like I said, so it's going to be in the same tier as Dark Hole, but it's going to be slightly above. So, like I said, Raigeki will be a niche card. Lightning Storm, on the other hand, is a lot more flexible because it can deal with any attack position card, or it can deal with any spell or trap, which is really impactful. However, it does have the restriction where you can't have any face-up cards to be able to activate it, which can come into play quite often. The card has its flexibilities, the card is really good in the side deck, and it's a card that does see play from time to time as a really good tech option against a lot of different strategies. You don't always know exactly what you're going to be playing against in a tournament, so having Lightning Storm and its flexibility to deal with back row or monsters can be really useful, and for that reason it belongs as playable in some side decks. Harpie's Feather Duster, on the other hand, is almost always going to be live. The card is phenomenal because not only can you activate it without any restrictions, so you don't have to have no monsters on the field, for example, but the card is always going to be good against pretty much every matchup in this format. Against Malice, it gets rid of all their back row and forces them to use it at a wrong moment. It's good against a deck like Ryzel because it gets rid of Ryzel Cross and whatever back row they might have. Maybe they have Great Purification if they're playing Mitsurugi and you can burn that card. But it's also really good against decks like Fiendsmith because if you can get rid of the equip spells on the Fiendsmith Desiree, they can no longer get extra negates, and they're forced to use their negate on the Duster for that reason. And of course, against Blue Eyes, it's really good because you can use it to get rid of the True Light. It's also good to bait out Drill Beam, for example. There's a ton of really unique applications and really good applications to use Harpie's Feather Duster. That being said, it's not a card you would ever see in the main deck, so for that reason I would put it as playable in most side decks. Another board breaker we see very often that kind of falls within the same category is going to be Interrupted Kaiju Slumber, which is basically going to be Dark Hole that summons out 2 monsters. Now this card is worse than regular Dark Hole for a few reasons. Number 1, it loses to Ash Blossom, which means they can just ash it and negate the destruction, which really sucks. But second, it actually gives your opponent a monster, and third, you have to be playing Kaijus in your deck, which also are not very good in this format. So for that reason, because Dark Hole is already a weak card, I would actually put Interrupted Kaiju Slumber in the Just Don't tier. But Kaijus, on the other hand, are also not very good right now. If you look at most decks in the format today, a single copy of 1-for-1 removal just isn't that good. Malice is able to bring back their monsters, Ryzel Detonator can bring itself back if Eclipse Twins is attached to it, and so on. There are so many great cards that are just able to recycle the resources pretty easily during your turn that Kaijus just aren't impactful enough. You have to really use cards that are a bit more wider in their application and deal with more cards than just a singular option. So just like Interrupted Kaiju Slumber, Kaijus belong in the Just Don't tier. But Lava Golem, on the other hand, is a much better card in my opinion. The fact that it's a 1-for-2 is really nice, and it can deal with a lot of really powerful endboards. However, it eats up your normal summon, which can really hurt, so depending on the deck, it could be a really problematic card to have in your hand. That being said, if you're able to resolve it and you don't need your normal summon, then you can really break boards very effectively. Most of the time, if you can summon out Lava Golem and set up your full end board, you're going to be able to win the duel. However, there are so few decks that can effectively play Lava Golem because a lot of decks in this format really rely on their normal summon. So for that reason, I would put Lava Golem in the niche tier. Sphere Mode is another really interesting card. It's a 1-for-3, which can be really good, especially against decks that go wide in their end boards. Decks like Malice, for example, even to a lesser extent Blue Eyes, and I guess at the same time some Fiendsmith variants do end up going wider. Ryzel a bit less because they can commonly end on a copy of Detonator and Duo Drive, so Sphere Mode is going to be dead. But at the end of the day, if Sphere Mode does hit the field and you're able to get rid of 3 opponents' monsters, it can be really strong. It's not always going to be live though. Lava Golem is a lot more consistent to actually resolve, and at the same time, Sphere Mode still eats your normal summon, so it's not going to be playable in as many decks. Because of that, I would say that Sphere Mode belongs in a niche tier. Kurikara Divincarnate is another tributing card, and it's another card that is part of this wider range of archetypes like the Kaijus and Lava Golem in my opinion. But it's really not that strong right now. Kurikara is at its best in a format where there are a lot of mandatory effects that have to activate on cards that are still going to be threatening after they use those mandatory effects. For example, Kashtira Arise Heart was the main culprit as to why Kurikara was seeing a lot of play. It had to activate its effects, they were all mandatory, and then you can tribute over it to get rid of the Macrocosmos effects. In this current format, there aren't really any decks that utilize a lot of mandatory effects quite often. In reality, there are so many better ways to beat your opponent's end board rather than just hoping they activate an effect that you can then tribute over with Kurikara. I strongly believe that Kurikara will be good once again, and I did definitely pick up my playset because I do think it'll be a strong card. However, right now, just don't play it. Up next is Dark Ruler No More, and we're finally back to alphabetical order. Dark Ruler is still a very strong card. The issue is, most of the end boards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Today are more reliant on their back row to be able to recycle and create a layered disruption than they are on their monsters to set up a powerful, indestructible end board. For example, against Malice, sure you can negate the Nightmare Griffin and the Abawaku, but they can just go ahead and use the Malice traps to get extra interruption and disrupt your graveyard. I've seen some decks actually play Dark Ruler No More, but it's really not as flexible as it once was, and doesn't have a lot of application when you're going first. So for that reason, Dark Ruler No More goes in the niche tier. Up next is Dinowrestler Pankratops, one of my favorite cards of all time, and the fact that it's not seeing a lot of play right now really hurts me, but it makes a lot of sense. If you look at the format right now, some of the best decks are Blue Eyes, Rizal, Malice, and the Fiendsmith variants. And against those strategies, how many of them have monsters that are bigger than 2600 attack? Well, Rizal does, Blue Eyes does, Fiendsmith Desiree definitely has, and of course there's also going to be Abawaku and Malice. These cards are really problematic, but additionally, Dinowrestler Pankratops, while it's good and flexible, it has a hard time beating a lot of the end boards right now because of their layered disruption and their protection. Pankratops was really good back in its heyday because it was essentially a 1-for-2 that you can choose when to activate as well. You can use it to beat over an opponent's monster that was threatening, and then on your opponent's turn you can use the effect to tribute itself and then pop a card, which could be very strong. In this current format though, that's not going to be as good. I still believe that if you want to play it, you definitely can, however, it's just not going to be as flexible as it once was. And for that reason, I would put Dinowrestler Pankratops in the niche tier. Enemy Controller is a great quick play spell and a solid board breaker. The issue with it is that not every deck can afford to play Econ. It's a pretty expensive card because its best effect requires you to tribute a monster you control, which is not what you want to do most of the time. It is very flexible, however, being able to be used on your opponent's turn or on your turn. I will also add that right now we did mention that cards like Change of Heart were in the just don't tier because they target and take control of an opponent's monster. And Econ is pretty much the exact same thing, but it also costs you to tribute a monster yourself, which can come into play. But it is more flexible because it can be used during your opponent's turn, so for that reason, even though it's not going to be as strong, I would say it does belong in the niche tier. Evenly Matched is like the face of board breakers in Yu-Gi-Oh! It's a phenomenal card, it gets rid of so many different cards your opponent has, and it's really hard for them to interact with it, assuming they don't have exactly SP Little Knights. Now some decks don't really care because they put up a very small end board, and some decks they care a lot, but they have ways to play around it. That being said, if it resolves, it's a phenomenal choice against so many strategies. It's just going to be a little bit harder to do. But if you can bait out their interruption, then Evenly Matched goes so hard. I still believe that even though Evenly Matched has fell off a bit, it still belongs in the playable in some side decks tier. Forbidden Chalice is a quick play that targets and negates a card and can be activated in the damage step, which is really nice. However, the card just really isn't as impactful because it doesn't have a ton of application in this format. I've already spoken about how cards that target in this format just are inherently weaker than other ones that don't. However, the card can have some application, but it's very, very limited. And in my opinion, there are just going to be better choices for negation than Forbidden Chalice. I really don't see any need to play Forbidden Chalice in this current format because the card just isn't as strong as so many other options that are kind of similar. So for that reason, just don't play Forbidden Chalice. Forbidden Droplet, on the other hand, is phenomenal. The card is incredibly flexible, can be activated during the damage step, it can't be responded to by whatever you send to the graveyard. It's an amazing card, and it doesn't deal with just one monster on the field, it can deal with plenty. Not every deck can take advantage of it, but the decks that can absolutely love it. It sends cards to the graveyard to act as starters, which can be really strong, and additionally, because it can be activated in the damage step, it gives it a lot more flexibility. It's a card that's phenomenal going first and going second. You can set it like a trap card and use it as a board breaker as well. It's a card that I think everyone should consider playing in their main deck right now. But again, not every deck can make the most out of this card, but decks that can absolutely love it, and the decks that can't, you should consider it still. So for that reason, I would put it as the playable in some main decks tier. Herald of the Abyss is really only good when you're dealing with a powerful Towers monster that is unaffected by your opponent's cards. That being said, in this format, there aren't really that many, if at all. Herald of the Abyss was seeing a lot more play back when Expertly Noir was in the format, and the fact that it's pretty much gone means you shouldn't really be considering to play this card. Because there's like no real application to use this card well right now, I would say that Herald of the Abyss belongs in the just don't tier. Kashtira Fenrir is a phenomenal card that acts as a board breaker and as a combo piece as well. This card is incredible, has a ton of ways to really interrupt the opponent, being a really big body, a level 7 that you can use to be able to start your plays, and additionally banishes cards face down, which is really hard to interact with. Almost any deck can actually play the Kashtira monsters, and Fenrir is arguably the best one. The only reason why Fenrir isn't in the playable in most main decks tier is because it's not a card that you can use as a defensive card when you're going second. You're using it very reactively in that regard. Compare that to a hand trap like Ash Blossom, for example. Ash Blossom stops your opponent from getting to their final end board, while Kashtira Fenrir just tries to deal with the final end board, and even then, doesn't do that always perfectly. It is a great card though, and if you can play it, I would definitely consider it. So for that reason, Kashtira Fenrir belongs in the playable in some main decks tier. Metaltronus is one of the most hyped cards in the game today. It is super flexible, it is a quick play spell that can be activated on either turn. It's a card that gets you a monster on the field and negates a card, or can just banish the threat altogether. For example, if your opponent summons out a Ryzel Detonator, then you can get rid of it pretty easily by summoning out a Blue Eyes White Dragon, for example. And a lot of players have been tagging in copies of Ryzel Detonator into their extra deck just for Metaltronus alone. It's really good against Fiendsmith decks and Malice decks, even Blue Eyes as well. Pretty much every meta deck in the format right now has weaknesses to Metaltronus. And for that reason, it is the first card we're going to add as the playable in most main decks tier. Snatch Steal is actually not very good right now. If you think about it like Change of Heart, it targets, it takes control of a monster, which sucks, but on top of that, it can just be negated basically by a Ryzel Detonator pop. So it's really not going to see that much play. So for that reason, just don't play Snatch Steal. Spellcard Monster Reborn is a really unique piece of disruption. It's able to deal with the opponent's graveyard in a really interesting way by taking cards that are really critical to their layered disruptions. For example, you can take a copy of Fiendsmith Desiree to shut off a negate after they use the effect of Agnum Day. It's also really good at taking a copy of Eclipse Twins, or whatever the Eclipse Twins would target rather, to be able to summon back to their side of the field. It's great against Malice to take something like Whitebinder. It's good against so many different strategies. However, the impact just isn't high enough, and that's really the problem. There are just going to be better cards to use than Spellcard Monster Reborn, even though it's a very flexible and strong option. I do think it's going to see a lot of meta play in the near future, but for the time being, it's just not as strong. So for that reason, I would put it in the niche tier. Super Polymerization is up next, and man, Super Poly is so good. This format is going to be even better because Duke of Demise is coming out in Maze of the Master, and this card changes so much. For those who don't know, Duke of Demise is a brand new fusion that requires 2 Fiend or Zombie monsters. And the fact that you can use it with the Fiendsmith engine, but you can also use it with the Nightmare Griffin and a Bawa Ku combo is really nice. It can't be destroyed by battle, which is really cool, and it's a level 6 Fiend monster, which is great for DDD Wave High King Caesar. However, it also gives you an additional normal summon, which is insane. So Super Poly is getting another amazing target, but it's also going to have cards like Garura, Mud Dragon of the Swamp, and even Predaplant Dragostapelia as well for certain decks. Before the release of Maze of the Master and Duke of Demise, I think that Super Poly would be a fine card to have, not too good, not too bad, but now that it's actually going to have another amazing Super Poly target, I would actually consider putting Super Poly as playable in some main decks. Triple Tactic Talents is an amazing card. It's great going first, it's great going second. It can rip cards out of the opponent's hand, but as a board breaker, it's a non-target take, which is really strong. Because even if your opponent tries to get rid of the card they would initially want you to target, like the Detonator for example, you can still get a body to your side of the field, which is really nice. The draw 2 can get you into more engine as well, but the big trade-off is going to be it's a dead card if your opponent doesn't do anything. If they don't activate any monster effects, it's just another blank card sitting in your hand. That being said, if you can resolve Triple Tactic Talents to take or to look at your opponent's hand, you're going to be in a great spot to win the game. Talents is a phenomenal card and definitely belongs as playable in most main decks. Triple Tactic Thrust though is a different story. This card is really good and is able to just get a ton of powerful normal spell and trap cards to win a game on the spot. For example, a very common play to see right now is for your opponents to go and activate a monster effect. You then use Triple Tactic Thrust to set a copy of Artifact Sanctum and be able to summon out Artifact Lancia from your deck to be able to stop your opponent's Malice plays from banishing their cards, which is going to shut down their entire turn. I just don't believe Thrust is going to see a lot of play in main decks. Sure it can, but I really don't think it's going to be that common. But I do think it's a great side deck card, and for that reason I would say it's playable in most side decks. Ultimate Slayer is another phenomenal board breaker in this format. Not only can your opponent not respond to it with monster effects, but it can also be used to send a copy of Meteorologic Aggregator to the graveyard to be able to get a negate for a card on the field and spin back a monster. That's really good. This card alone can kind of just shut down an entire Rizal player's end board. It's lost some popularity because it can only be used during your turn and kind of a reactive card, but it also takes up quite a bit amount of extra deck space as well, which can be problematic. That being said, if you have space in your extra deck for all the different types of extra deck mechanics like Fusion, Synchro, Xyz, and Link, then yes, this card can be phenomenal. However, not everyone does, and sacrificing the flexibility in your extra deck for other cards that may not be as impactful isn't always a wise decision. But it's still a great card nonetheless, and in my opinion should be playable in some main decks. Vesper Girsu is a really interesting board breaker that I do believe we'll see some play in the future. However, it relies on your opponent to make a decision, which is not always going to be what you want them to do. At the same time, end boards really aren't going to be that wide when it comes to monsters. It's really going to be a bit more condensed, filled with spell and trap cards, so Vesper Girsu just isn't going to be as strong as it would be in other formats. So for that reason, just don't play Vesper Girsu. And finally is XYZ Encore, which is good against exactly one deck this format, and that deck is obviously going to be Rizal. Using it on Rizal is great because you can get rid of all the material on the Rizal detonator, making it pretty much impossible for them to have as many disruptions as they once would have had. But even though it's a phenomenal card against Rizal, it's not going to see that much play because it's so damn niche. It's so hyper specific against one deck. But of course, that deck is the best deck of the format, so it's going to still see some play, and I do believe it should see some play in some side decks. So there you have it. This is my tier list for the best board breakers in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! In March 2025. Now, there's going to be a ton of decks I didn't talk about in this video that are going to be really popular. For example, Mermail is a great deck, however, it's really not going to be a deck that you would use board breakers against, more so hand traps, because if you don't use hand traps, you're going to lose the game. That being said, if you disagree with my placement of any of these cards on the list, let me know down in the comments below, but make sure to give a reason as well. If you enjoyed the video, then make sure to smash the like button and of course subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Make sure to check out my tier list for the best hand traps in the format. That video will be linked up in the cards right now. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all next time.